Hey, US History, it's good to see you guys again this week. We are now finally ending Chapter 19, talking about the outcome of World War I and how it affected us here in America. We're going to name the treaty that ended World War I. We're going to discuss the Big Four at Versailles and discuss the reasons that the Treaty of Versailles failed to gain ratification in the United States. This week, you should have already read Chapter 19. You should be done with that by now, but if you're not, definitely type anything you haven't read. It'll definitely help you on the test we're taking this week, trust me. You don't have to, but if you want, you can begin reading Chapter 20 if you want to get ahead for next week. That's your call. Okay, point one, the treaty that ended World War I was called the Treaty of Versailles. Now, to be fair here, there were several treaties from several nations, and it's not really fair to say, oh, this one treaty ended the war for everybody. But it's generally considered to be the treaty that ended World War I just because it involved the major players in the actual war, so it was arguably the most weighted or the most significant of the treaties that were signed. So the Treaty of Versailles is what generally is considered to be what ended World War I and basically put conditions in place for the loser, which was Germany. And Germany was banned from negotiations. They were not allowed in on this club. So it's too bad. I kind of feel bad for them. It's kind of like when all your friends, maybe back in grade school, when you see like 3 or 4 of your friends talking and you're not really invited. You just kind of sit there and whatever, play on your phone. For me, it was my Game Boy. Just be sad. And that's how Germany was. Germany just kind of sat there twiddling their thumbs saying, I wonder what's going to happen to us now. They were banned from negotiations. The war guilt clause in the treaty placed all blame on Germany. It was their fault. They needed to receive the blame, accept it, and they were required to pay a ton of money to the Allies, more than $30 billion, which was insane, by the way. And it's interesting, actually, if you didn't know this, Germany actually made their last official payment in 2010. So it wasn't that long ago, about 10 years ago almost. Germany made their final payment for the demands of the Treaty of Versailles. So kudos to them, for in spite of World War II and all the craziness they've been through, they actually made due to their commitment. They've paid off what they were supposed to. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, so the Treaty of Versailles, again, ended World War I. And Germany was not allowed to be in the negotiations, and they were required to pay a ton of money. But there's more than that, too. Wilson's 14 points. We talked about this last class, that Wilson, that idealist, was excited about all these ideas to make the world a safe place. And Wilson's, we're going to talk about his personal role here in a little bit, but for now, just looking at his actual ideas, only 2 of the points somewhat got included in the treaty. One was national self-determination for peoples in Europe, so giving more autonomy to different nations that were tended to be sort of subsumed by bigger nations, so giving more national self-determination, but also forming the League of Nations, which was the idea that rather than just going to fight each other, that nations would send representatives and they could meet and discuss and try to figure out solutions that didn't involve violence. It kind of reminds me of Wilson's quote, "Peace without victory." That's what he'd been saying from the beginning, the idea that maybe we can have peace without having to win a war. Maybe there are alternate means. I remember I've actually never been in a fist fight in my life. Excluding my brothers, of course, but at school, there was only one time where this guy walked up to me and it was a long story, but he wanted to fight me. And I'm a pretty mild-mannered guy. I usually just talk my way to things. But I remember I stomped my foot and I said, "Bring it!" And this guy just walked away, and that was it. Nothing happened. I'm glad I could just use. Maybe that was the Teddy Roosevelt approach more than a Wilsonian approach. But at any rate, it is better to get out of violence if possible. And Wilson probably would have, if Wilson were in my shoes, he probably would have sat down with the bully and said, "Let's have a cup of tea and discuss. Why is it that you want to pummel me? Why is it that you want to do that?" So, I digress. Point being that Wilson wanted to have the nations come together and resolve disputes amicably. A few other things worth noting, and this isn't even in our chapter, but I just want to point this out. There were a lot of territory changes. You don't need to know this for the test. I'm not going to make you know this, but the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of 25,000 square miles of territory, and 7 million people all of a sudden were found in this weird spot of, I guess we're not in Germany anymore. I just imagine, back when I was living in Arizona, it's like, imagine if Mexico all of a sudden won back the territory of Arizona, and all the millions of people in Arizona were like, oh, I guess we're not in America anymore. Now we're in Mexico, but there were millions of people that were in this weird spot. France and Germany have been fighting over this strip of land right here called the Alsace-Lorraine. I'm not even going to try to say the actual French way, but Alsace-Lorraine is how I say it. But this strip of land is a pretty valuable piece of land with some good resources, and Germany had just recently taken that from France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And now here you have France. They're pissed. They're not very happy about how Germany killed many men from France. So they want that land back, and they claimed it back. But you also have the Sudetenland, which is over in this general area. And the Sudetenland is going to play a pretty important role in World War II. So just keep that in mind. But we're not going to go much further than that for today. And one other thing I want to mention is the Rhineland area here, which is a western part of Germany. Basically, it's west of the Rhine River. That's what's called the Rhineland. And the Allies were to occupy that land for 15 years just to make sure Germany was being good. Although after 12 years, they ended it. They just said whatever. 1930, they just all left, the Allied troops. But for about 12 years, though, you had Allied troops in there stationed watching over German operations. Okay, so moving back to our main points. Objective 2, the Big Four at Versailles. The Big Four are these leaders you see pictured here, and I found this pretty cool picture that gives a number to each one so that I could put a corresponding chart over here. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, you can see number 1. Then and he famously said about Germany, "We'll squeeze them till the pips squeak." So he wanted to basically punish Germany and get everything he could out of them. Then at number 2, you have Vittorio Orlando, and he is from Italy, as you can see. Then you have Georges Clemenceau of France, right here. And 4th is Woodrow Wilson of the United States. And it's funny, I should mention, when these guys were together, again, there were other nations involved, certainly, but these were the Big Four. These were the ones that really, had the power to set the conditions. But it's funny because at one point, David Lloyd George, when he went back to Great Britain, he was sick of some of the squabbling, and he had to sit between Woodrow Wilson and Georges Clemenceau of France. Georges Clemenceau of France, and he said, "I felt like I was sitting between Jesus Christ, Wilson, and Napoleon Bonaparte, Clemenceau." So you have this ruthless, angry man wanting more territory, and this peaceful, calm, reserved kind of guy on the other side. So it's kind of a funny story there. But these 4 were the ones who discussed what they were going to do after the war. Wilson wanted to participate personally. He wanted to be there. He wanted to make a presence. He was extremely popular in Europe, and people were applauding him. So he went, and to much fanfare, over to this meeting in France. However, he made a pretty big blunder. He didn't get any Republicans to support him. He had a lot of enemies from the Republicans, and they didn't really like his ideas very much. So he didn't gain any Republican support, and he left for a long time, basically trying to fight his own battles over in Europe, but leaving his enemies, Republicans, to basically entrench themselves and figure out how to get their ways back at home. So we'll see if this comes back to bite him when he comes back. Okay, number 3, the reasons the Treaty of Versailles failed to gain ratification in the United States. So after these meetings, after they came up with their ideas, Wilson comes back and he's so excited. He's like, "I got some great ideas, you guys. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to this League of Nations, and here's the Treaty of Versailles, and it's going to be great, and there's going to be world peace, and blah, blah, blah." Problem. Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican. He was the Senate Majority Leader. Now, government's next year, but basically in the Senate, you have the majority party, whoever has more people, basically, right? So right now the Republicans are the majority party. So they choose basically a majority leader, and he's the guy who represents the greater interest of the Senate. He's a very powerful person. In the House of Representatives, you have the Speaker of the House. The dominant party is to choose their Speaker of the House, and that's a very powerful person as well. So basically, this Henry Cabot Lodge guy was a force to be reckoned with. And so Wilson has to deal with him. And it's funny because they actually both hate each other, absolutely despise each other. And to put that into perspective, I know Pelosi's not a senator, but she's the Speaker of the House, which is even more powerful. And imagine Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump trying to get together and see eye to eye and make a compromise. Yeah, probably not going to happen, right? That's essentially what happened with Wilson and Lodge. Just picture Trump and Pelosi if you're trying to understand this. They didn't get along, and they didn't like each other's ideas. The Treaty of Versailles included the League of Nations, and Lodge's concern, which is a good concern, is how is this going to violate American sovereignty? We're our own nation. We don't want to be tangled in European affairs. What if we get dragged into future wars? What if this? What if that? There were some really good concerns that Lodge and the Republicans had, and many Americans for that matter too. So the Republicans, none of them really liked it, but they divided into two groups. And this might remind you when we talk about the half-breeds and the radical Republicans in the post-Civil War era, it's kind of a similar thing here, where basically you have some Republicans are called the irreconcilables. They said, absolutely not, we don't want any treaty. We don't want anything to do with the Treaty of Versailles, period. But then you have the reservationists, and these were Republicans who said, well, I could see it being a good idea if we have some parameters to make sure that we have a way out, that U.S. commitment is limited in European affairs. So these two halves of the Republican Party are battling it out right now. Wilson, on the other hand, he's committed to getting the whole thing passed. He's not going to give up. So Lodge made a joke. Again, we're talking about Lodge, we're talking about this guy right here, right? And Lodge made a joke I like. He said, the beautiful scheme of making mankind virtuous by a statute or a written constitution. And what he meant by that was Wilson's an idealist. We talked about this the first lesson. Wilson has all these great ideas that look great on paper, but they don't always play out very well in reality. And this is a cartoon that I think is hilarious. This is Woodrow Wilson. You can see it says idealism, and in one of his bubbles he's blowing is the League of Nations, right? So it's a pipe dream. Now, by the way, you've probably heard of that expression, a pipe dream. Where that comes from is back in this time, people smoked opium a lot. And opium would put you in this euphoric high state, and you could have all sorts of great ideas when you were high. So the idea of a pipe dream is, it's a fantasy. It's something that's just not realistic. You would have the idea when you're high, when you're smoking opium. So the idea is that Wilson's smoking the opium pipe and coming up with these grand ideas that will just never work. And Lodge has a good point. He's, maybe Wilson should consider human nature. Again, the progressivists said, well, human nature is this malleable thing that's evolving and can be made perfect with the right conditions. Whereas the Christian view is, no, we're depraved by nature and we're always messed up and selfish. And that doesn't mean we don't try, but we need to recognize the truth in the process. So he thought Wilson's ideas were just too grandiose. Here's some other comics I like. You have here, this is funny, the dove carrying the olive branch has been a symbol of peace for a long time. And it goes back to the Bible. You remember when Noah sent out the dove and it came back with the branch? That symbol is God is at peace again with mankind. God flooded the world out of wrath, because of all the sin, but now that the water is receding, God is now at peace again with humans. So that's what the symbol means, the dove carrying the olive branch. You probably remember the olive branch petition from the Revolutionary War, America wanting peace with Great Britain. Well, what this comic is portraying is you have a dove here, and it's a massive branch of a tree. It says League of Nations, and Wilson's like, come on, dove, you can carry this branch, right? And the joke is that it's way too much for the dove of peace to carry. It's too cumbersome, it's ridiculous. It's just not realistic. The League of Nations won't work. So the poor dove's not going to be able to carry this tree branch of the League of Nations. And the second one here is, it's hard to, I don't know if you guys can see, but it says here House and Senate, right? And they're obviously not agreeing with Wilson, so he's carrying the League of Nations and he's running to the American people. And let me explain that. We're going to see the next few slides, but basically Wilson continually tried to get the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles passed. He wanted us to be a part of it, but the House and the Senate would not work together to make it happen. And the Democrats had already lost their majority, I should mention, to the Republicans. So Wilson gets this idea that he's going to go directly to the people himself and convince the people that it's a good idea. So what happened was Wilson wouldn't compromise, so he basically went this massive tour across the United States with many speeches promoting this idea. We need the Treaty of Versailles, we need the League of Nations, and he just exhausted himself, and some have argued he even drove himself to his own death, essentially, because in Colorado in 1919 he had a stroke, and he never could recover fully. For months he was out of commission, and his wife and one of his close aides really talked for him, and basically he couldn't do much, though, because he was incapacitated. And in the midst of his being incapacitated, though, the Republicans finally came up with an idea, and some Democrats, and basically they said, okay, here's a compromised version of us joining the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. But ironically enough, and I just find this fascinating, Wilson ended up siding with the irreconcilables. Remember we talked about the extreme Republicans who hated him and wanted nothing to do with him? He sided with those guys because he could not stand a compromised version for him of the treaty or of the League of Nations as being part of it. For him, it was all or none. You couldn't be in the middle. So in the end, nothing passed for him. Neither did the U.S. ratify the Treaty of Versailles, nor did we join the League of Nations. We passed independent legislation to end our involvement with Germany in war. So I find that fascinating. And Wilson, he wouldn't even accept the compromise version. In the end, he ended up siding with his worst enemies to prevent a modified version of his ideas being passed, because it was all or none. Here's the question I have for you to think about. Do you think it's smart to take an all or none approach? Do you see his idealism at work here? Idealists want everything. They don't understand the art of compromise. That's why you get people like Bernie Sanders or Ron Paul. They're both very idealistic, and I really like Ron Paul personally. But they're very idealistic, and they struggle to get a lot done because they're not willing to meet in the middle with other people. And Woodrow Wilson, you can see that idealism coming out, that he has these ideas that look great on paper, and so reality must match the paper, rather than understanding that there's got to be a middle point somewhere. Okay, so this week, I hope that makes sense of a little bit of the outcome of World War I and how America handled it, how Wilson handled everything. For this week, here's what we're going to do. You already watched the lecture, so kudos to you. Watch CNN 10 and leave a comment by the end of the week. I'm not going to have a discussion this week because I want you to focus on the assessment. And the assessment's going to take you some time. And some teachers will only give you 1 or 2 days to do tests. I'm giving you guys several days because I'm kind of merging research paper with test. That's the way I'm doing it. So it requires you to prove you know what you're talking about. But I need to give you time so you can write it out and express yourself fully and maybe do supplemental research if need be. I will say, if you watch my lectures and take notes, and if you read the chapter, you won't even really need to do research. Unless I tell you to look up something, you're not going to need to even use the internet, but you're welcome to. If you need help clarifying something, that's fine. But watch the lectures and take notes. If you don't, I can tell you're not going to do well. You're probably going to get a C if you fudge it good enough, but you may get a D or an F as well. So watch the lectures, take notes, and do the reading. Don't plagiarize, and I'm not going to mark you for plagiarism. I know it's a little bit confusing how we're doing things, but if you just copy and paste different answers from different resources, I can tell, and I'm just going to give you a 0 for that because it's not your words. You need to prove you understand it, not that you can use Google to find answers. Point is, can you make sense of what we're talking about? So you can supplement your writing with sources. If occasionally you want to cite something, that's fine. Or if you want to use that to clarify, that's fine. But if you're just copying answers, I'm not going to give you any credit. Okay, and lastly is write substantially. Some of you did a phenomenal job. I was really impressed with some of your tests this last time. But some of you were trying to skimp by with 2 sentences or 3 really simple, sloppy sentences. And if you do that, you're automatically I'm going to deduct a ton of points because there's no way you're expressing yourself fully with 3 sentences that are simple. I'm sorry. So as Mrs. Wolf would say, don't shortchange me. Come on, man. Express yourself. Give yourself some time to write out your thoughts fully. If you're going to wait till Friday afternoon to do it, then you're probably going to get a D or an F. But if you take time early and you work through this, ask questions, shoot me an email if you're confused. I'd love to help you. So take time in your assessment, watch CNN 10 and do the comment, and let me know if you have any questions. I love you guys and have a great rest of the day. Peace out.